From Tumwater, Washington, going out to the 5 counties and beyond. No Shh, it's the TRL Podcast. I'm Chris.
I'm Annalisa, and we are your hosts for the Library Podcast that talks about more than just books. Hi, Chris.
Hello, Annalisa.
How are you?
Well, I'm going to tell you a little anecdote about me to answer that question.
Great.
So, I was once described in a annual performance evaluation as a beacon of positivity in challenging times. And that is a truth fact. You can look that up, or you could if you were in HR and had access to that. It actually happened. So I'm a pretty positive guy in general. But these are trying times, and the times, they're trying me.
The horrors persist, but so do we.
And yeah, exactly. Very well said.
Well, that's I guess that's one way to segue into our episode, which I think is very timely. If you want to...
Probably one of the more timely topics we've ever covered. We scheduled this a couple weeks ago and had to reschedule, and in that time, things have actually happened. So we've talked on the podcast in the past about various threats to libraries. We talked about censorship and intellectual freedom in our very first episode to kind of kick it off. And this is another kind of more direct threat to libraries in terms of library funding. So we're going to be talking about the Institute of Museum and Library Services, IMLS, which on the 14th of March was basically directed by executive order to reduce operations to the minimum amount required by law, which is open to interpretation. But essentially, the IMLS has been, gutted. And so we're going to talk about what IMLS is and why that matters, and why that matters specifically to us in Washington and at TRL, and kind of take it from there. And our guest today is the person to talk to about that. We have State Librarian Sara Jones. Welcome, Sara.
Thank you. It's good to be here. I also understand it's really difficult times, and keeping that optimism it's a challenge even for those of us that are hopeless optimistic.
I tend not to take myself too seriously in any situation or any topic too seriously, but this is kind of a big one for us in the library world.
Well, I think a good place to start, because prior to working in libraries, we are seeing a lot of headlines right now that say IMLS. And I prior to working for a library, I would not have known what that was. So, for the people that are listening that don't really know what IMLS is, could you explain that for us?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So the Institute of Museums and Library Services is the only federal agency that supports libraries in a coordinated and dedicated way. And it came into existence in 1996, but that is not the beginning of federal coordination of libraries. In fact, there's been support for libraries, I believe, since about 1965. And an interesting fact for your viewers here is that there really wouldn't be a Timberland district without federal support for libraries. So in the early times when a state librarian, I think it was in 1960s-ish, the state librarian here in the state of Washington decided that it would be great if there could be districts, and that multiple counties could get together and provide library services just as Timberland does. Mm-hmm. And of course, those of you, you're intimately involved with what is going on with Timberland today. It took some carrots to tell local communities this will be better if you join together, and if you if you spend resources together, and that you're one unit. So there was, at that point, there was federal funding that was called the Library Services and Construction Act. So it predates IMLS, but it's still the same type thing, a federal agency that supports libraries through grants to states, and then the states decide how those grants are most effective. So at the time, and I don't know, it's kind of the insider game to libraries, but the state of Washington is really a leader in having district libraries. It doesn't really happen in very many other states, if at all in other states. I was a state librarian in the state of Nevada, and we were able to have tri-county districts, but only by contract. And every year we renewed contracts with our multiple counties. So you can imagine how difficult that is to, always keep everybody happy. So I guess, this whole idea that maybe this is, kind of a sad thing, but not going to hurt too much. All the roots of the foundation of great library services in this country really come from that federal funding. And the modern Institute of Museum and Library Services was a staff of about, I think, 70 or 75 people who managed about between $230 and $270 million, which is far less than the state of Washington local support for libraries is, significantly. I think in the state of Washington, our local support for libraries is about $400 million. So at the national level, with significantly less money, they are still making a tremendous difference. The primary backbone of those resources was a program called Grants to States. And what that does is it gives every state an allotment of money to, again, support and expand libraries. There are very few actual rules about it, but one of the basic rules is that you must serve rural and underserved. So that's why we don't just formula back out to you all, because our dedication is to the rural and underserved communities with those resources. So I think, that's a basic understanding. And when it was put in place in 1996, the idea was that because it's museum and libraries, that you'd have, for 4 years, you'd have a library director. So someone who had a master's in library science. And then for 4 years, you'd have a museum director who had, appropriate museum credentials. And that went back and forth, like I said, since 1996. I've been actively in libraries since 1985. I've had some kind of grant or been in charge of these grants my entire library career, so 40 years. So it's pretty amazing to think that something that foundational might is at risk and might go away.
And you talk about the amount of money that is appropriated to IMLS, and a lot has been made of just how little that really is in the grand scheme of things. The ALA had quoted, I think, 0.003%, and that's libraries. If you include museums in there, it's 0.0046%. So we're talking about, tens, hundreds, thousands, like 0.001% or 46 0.001% of the wider federal budget. And what is able to be done with such a small slice of that money is really impressive. And I've been working in libraries myself for 17 years now, going on 18 years. And even as a librarian, I've been aware of IMLS. I mean, that it exists and that it's out there, and kind of just generally speaking, unless you're engaging with the grants directly, that it's out there and it's doing good work, but you don't have, I personally, speaking for myself, haven't had to think too hard about it, because it's there. It happens. Yeah. It's something that, there's federal support for libraries. You see the little footer on the bottom of websites that say, supported by IMLS. And so I've, even being in the field, have learned more about IMLS and what it does in the past couple of weeks, and like how that works, like the intricacies of that, than I have had to think about in my entire professional career, in the most kind of unfortunate sense. Like you wish that it wouldn't have had to happen that way, but it supports a lot of really good work. So I think the next thing to talk about is, like, what are some of the things that IMLS supports, specifically in Washington?
Yeah. So the $3.9 million that we get in Washington supports a large variety of things. And, some things that we've done historically for many, many years, and newer and more innovative things. About a third of our grant award goes to support a couple of significant statewide programs. The Washington Talking Book and Braille Library, which is located in Seattle, but serves patrons all across the state. And it has significant IMLS support, or I might use the acronym LSTA, which is the Library Services and Technology Act, which is the part of the Institute of Museums and Library Services funding that goes to states directly, and then is, like I said, is given to us in a way that we can make decisions about.
Right.
So, and I think that's what's really important for people to understand. So the way it will be spent in Washington will be very different than the way it might be spent in any other state. So in Washington, we have, for many, many years, I think probably since there's been federal funding available, we've supported the institutional library services, which is services to incarcerated individuals and people in Eastern and Western hospital. So that's been a pretty significant part of our grant. It funds, it has funded as many as 10 or 11 people and a variety of other resources. Up until just a few years ago, it was the only funding source we had to serve those people that are, but for us would not really have library services, or might have them so, desperately terrible, just to be honest, to actually have qualified librarians, a public library in all those institutions, and books and materials for incarcerated individuals and people who are in Eastern and Western hospitals here in our state. We lead the country in that program. There is no other like program to that. So, like I said, decades ago, a state librarian said that's really important to the state of Washington. So we're going to use a very significant portion of our federal money to do that. And then, as I mentioned, the Washington Talking Book in Braille, like many other programs across the whole nation, has pretty significant support from that federal funding too. It's not in its entirety. They also have some state funding, and they have some private funding. But for that, they wouldn't have recording booths. They have we have 15 recording booths, so 15 kind of identical setups to this in,
I think
in
that's
Seattle.
One interesting thing about the Talking Book and Braille Library is they produce content.
They do.
It's not just a matter of getting content in people's hands and distributing what already exists, but they're actually producing content that wouldn't otherwise exist.
Exactly. Yeah. So the partnership there is that each talking book and some have Braille and some don't, but we have also a really exceptional Braille program. But each talking book records their local materials. So Washington authors or things about Washington, we will record those. And then every state does that. And then the National Library Service records some things. But what's really amazing about it is because of something called the Marrakesh Treaty, we share those worldwide. So if you have the reason, if there's some reason that you can't read print, a visual disability, a reading disability, just the not being able to hold a book, in this entire world, there are books available to you at no cost, which is really a breathtaking statement to make. And the Marrakesh Treaty was a long, really an amazing thing to put in place to say that. So essentially, it gets us outside of copyright. So the normal copyright that the rest of us all use in the library world, you can be outside of that copyright if your services are to those individuals. So those two programs are a third of the resources that come into us from the Institute of Museums and Library Services. And I know we'll go talk into this, but about this further is both of those programs are in jeopardy. We do have some funding resources, so I can't tell people that they will cease to exist, but they will cease to be excellent. They will cease to be able to serve an underserved population with no other resources and choices. And it's incredibly painful to think about that, of having to choose, which libraries we keep, which ones we don't. Staff will be laid off. It's hard to even imagine what that's going to feel like. And then the other 2/3 support a variety of library things that people hearing this will know about. We do at the state level databases, so that we buy those for everybody. So school libraries, colleges, and public libraries. And so by buying them at the state level, we can get them at a really good discount. And those are provided to everyone. There are some, people put in some money, but if they were buying them individually, it'd be probably 20 to 30 times the cost to be purchased individually.
I think that's something that at Timberland, our patrons would absolutely notice that.
Yes.
I mean, we refer folks to Talking Book and Braille Library. We have partnerships with institutional library services to give library cards to inmates who are reentering society. But people, unless you're directly impacted by that yourself, or have a loved one or a family member who is, you may not know that that's happening. You may not notice that. Right. But the coordinated or the statewide database licensing project, that's something that our patrons would absolutely feel.
And I know one thing that Timberland does so effectively is your partnership with schools. Mm-hmm. So it's really incredibly important that there's a level playing field of the educational resources that are available to both the public library patrons and the school library patrons. But for us, schools simply, like, their school library budgets are virtually nothing.
Right.
So, to be able to have a student able to, come to the public library, get some help with those databases, and then have them available in their classroom and their school library too. I think that kind of loss, it's again one that I think is really going to be profound and has this terrible ripple effect of, students using poor resources because they, inadequate, not useful, wrong, because they don't have, curated and accurate information, which is what those statewide databases do. And to be honest, I think most states do this. Most states license state databases, and they mostly do it with the federal money. So the ripple effect is that these companies, we use Gale right now, but there's ProQuest and there's some, there's really like 2 or 3 big players in the entire United States. They likely will see bankruptcy over this because they don't have that aggregate buying at all 50 states level is a huge piece of their business, and they might not be able to exist without us. So this idea that this isn't very impactful and won't hurt very many people, it's just not true.
Yeah, the program you're referring to, for anyone who's listening who doesn't know, is my TRL program. And this is for, I think, nearly all, if not all of the school districts in our service area have partnered with Timberland to give special library cards to all of the students, called My TRL cards. And it's separate from a normal library card that a student might have that they visit a library and sign up for an account. And it's basically what it does is it grants them access to all of the online resources, ebooks, online databases, things like that. So the schools can use Timberland databases in the course of their, curriculum and their teaching. They can introduce students to the wealth of library resources available to them because we're issuing those cards, through the school that way. So if a student doesn't have a library card, otherwise they do have one through the MyTRL program. And so the database package you're referring to through Gale, that's a lot of databases that are specifically targeted for students who are doing research. And there's, of course, broader general interest academic databases rolled into that as well. But these are things that, were it not for this program that subsidizes or pays for the databases, the subscriptions, we may not be able to pay for that on our own at TRL. Or at the very least, if we were to subscribe individually, would have to find that money somewhere else. And we're not rolling in the money here at Timberland either, as most public libraries are not. So it's all a trade-off here. It's a very valuable thing, but were we to subscribe to it independently, we'd have to look at cutting something else. And that's going to impact someone who uses that resource. So yeah, when you talk about a ripple effect, it's very, very true.
And just the fact that I think the databases are one of the reasons why libraries started this good coordination. It made sense to, have the resources be consistent in both places. And then what's great about it is that a student would be, they will get guidance and support for those resources at school because they're the same guidance and support at the public library. And then when they move to community college or other college, they will still have a consistent way to understand that that's vetted, accurate, real information, not just an internet or Google search that you're not sure if the information is actually accurate or vetted. So that kind of consistency over time, I think, makes better students and better outcomes for them. So it's I guess that as I talk about this, and I have been talking about it a lot, there's just a real ecosystem that we've created. And, you mentioned that I had a news interview, and, one of the things that they did say there is that one of the things I said that they played was, I don't think, it just makes me really disturbed to think that we won't know how bad this is until it's gone, until we see the gaps and the problems, and someone says, but I thought we had something that did this, and they say, well, no, we don't. We also we support librarians through the Washington Library Association and through all kinds of training opportunities, which every size of library has takes some advantage of. So it really is, well, like I said, is it a big portion of a budget? No, but does it have a very large effect? Yes.
And I was looking through the 5-year plan that the state library submits essentially to IMLS. Correct me if I'm getting that wrong, but I was reading through this 38-page report of things that have been done with this funding and that are planned to be done, what the goals are, and some of the things that you're already talking about are, supporting people who are print disabled or incarcerated populations, but there's just so much detail there.
Right.
So for anyone who's curious about this, the reach of this funding, there's a lot of information out there. It's on the IMLS website for now, I guess. But so I've been downloading copies of some of this stuff just to be safe. But
yeah, I think that's probably wise.
But you can look in detail about where the money goes, and so it's not this mystery amount of money. It's $290 million that we don't really know what's happening with it. You can go kind of grant by grant and see what the impacts are, what the goals that the money is meant to meet and to accomplish. What it's doing is not a secret.
Right. And I think it's one of the things that's hard about this whole conversation, the whole why of this is, with the idea that the Institute's eliminated with this idea that they're looking for efficiency and effectiveness. And, it is bar none one of the most effective and efficient use of money that I've ever seen. And we've actually had, that's been said to us. So one of the programs that we do that's pretty significant, it's not, as Timberland's a good sized district and you're able to do this yourself, but many other libraries, about 25 right now, have difficulty figuring out how to get high speed access. It's not that they can't do it, but it's incredibly expensive. And then the hardware and the software, and then the actual connectivity, and then accessing federal funds to support that connectivity. So we support 25 libraries across the state, and we have one person that coordinates that does the actual buying of the hardware and software. And then we have another consultant that helps them access E-rate. So by accessing E-rate, they're getting that high-speed broadband access for 20 cents on the dollar. So they get an 80% reimbursement back. But for us, it's a complicated thing. I'm sure that whoever does that here at Timberland would go, whoa, it's very complicated.
It is, I'm told, extremely complicated.
Yeah. So smaller libraries at the end, while it's a great deal of money, they just can't. The complication is too much. And then mostly what happens with those smaller libraries too is they are getting their internet through the city. So the city, there's issues about how much the city wants to pay, but also there's just a real conflict in the way city wants to provide internet for city workers and where a library wants to provide internet for their community.
Right.
It's public access, and it has, needs to have a lot of protections just from that nature of public access. So most cities are like, we just prefer not to do this. So I tell this because the Everett IT people, and Everett is not a teeny place. It's not, a rural place, and it's a robust library. But they came to us and said, we'd like to partake in this program, and we helped them. We actually hope to put some more hardware and software out to make it even better in a few weeks. We've had to cancel that because our money's been canceled. But the IT person said this is the most effective and efficient use of federal money he'd ever seen in his entire career. And this was long before there was a Department of Government Efficiency. I've been in government work and library work for a very long time. And it's, as you said, every single dollar is accounted for. You have to know what your project outcomes are going to be before you're given a penny, and then you're asked to tell, did you meet those project outcomes or exceed them? So it's just this idea that there's any fraud or waste or abuse or, people sitting around doing nothing. It's just a total fiction.
It's especially comical in the library world just because of how familiar doing more with less is to us.
Yes.
In the library world, that's what we do. Especially in public libraries, the funding increases are essentially non-existent.
No.
I mean, it's very difficult, to raise your levy rate, for example. So we're constantly looking for ways to be, efficient and effective and to do more and bring more to more of our population.
Right.
On
it is
flat or declining money,
It's an absolute core value for us, and one that we work very hard on. And it's the profession just doesn't do anything but just what you say. It's okay. What resources do we have? How do we provide them most effectively? But I think we're also really innovative too. So if we can do things that are interesting or different, this has been some money that's helped with that.
Yeah, definitely. It's not all serious.
Yeah,
internet funding and things like that.
A couple other programs that kind of go down that line is that we supported Spokane Public Library. There's a new the way that we organize our our catalog, our ILS, which is they're also not the best product in the entire world, I think I can say. But anyway, there's a new product out there called Folio that the Library of Congress is going to use, and Spokane is going to use it too. So we used LSTA money in partnership with Spokane and the parent company of Folio to develop that so that it would be more accessible to other public libraries. So that's something that a Timberland or a Seattle or a Snow Isle or a Pierce could be very interested in, because they're the most important catalog to all of us is the Library of Congress catalog. Mm-hmm. So if this product Folio is good enough for them, it might possibly be good enough for lots of us. But the way it's viewed and used for the Library of Congress would be quite different than how it will be used for a public library with a lot of circulation, because the Library of Congress isn't really a circulating library. So that functionality would have to really be developed. So we gave a significant amount of our Library Services and Technology Act to Spokane to do that, and that's one of those things that is very innovative, and that kind of investment, could really pay off for lots of different kinds of libraries. And then one that we like to talk about that I think is really fun, and we've not spent a lot of money on this, but we've had a tremendous impact from it, we've been supporting role-play tabletop gaming like Dungeons and Dragons and other role-play games. And we've done that with federal money, maybe in the amount of, $25,000, and that's again all over the state. Lots of libraries are doing it. They're doing incredibly innovative things like making games, and teams are running programs, and it's just it's a really great way to get the community together and to have an experience that's fun and exciting, and brings people of all kinds of backgrounds together. So those are a couple of programs that I think we've touched. All types of libraries, all sizes of libraries, with their small amount of money, but with a big impact.
The Secretary of State did come to the Chehalis Timberland Library to play an exciting game of D&D. I don't even know if that's the right term, game. I think there's a different.
Yeah.
I think might be a different word.
Well, they generally call it either role play tabletop gaming or tabletop role play gaming, whichever way. I've seen it both ways, but yeah, it is definitely a game, and I think that we've been all over. He's done it there. We went to Yakima. We went to Camas. We'll be this week on Thursday night at our library conference. He'll be playing. So
he's made a name for himself in the D&D community.
It's certainly, it's an interesting program, and it's so interesting. And how it's related here is that we said, hey, Washington's doing some really great work with this, and we applied to the Institute of Museums and Library Services for a $250,000 leadership grant. We partnered with Wisconsin, because those of you that are gamers that are listening to this, Wisconsin is a beginning time for Wizards of the Coast before they were here. Okay. So the roots of Dungeons and Dragons is actually in Wisconsin. But those are the two state libraries, Wisconsin and Washington. We partnered. They were looking at the really cool things that we were doing, and they have the University of Madison, Wisconsin, has a whole component of their university practices is understanding the value of gaming, all types of gaming, so not just in person but online gaming too. So we're partnering with them. We were given this grant award July or August of last year, $250,000, and we're just waiting for that to be pulled out from underneath us too, so it's basic, bread and butter and all kinds of other interesting things that are being just essentially eliminated. And almost the worst part is we don't know when or how or why. We just are told it's going to be gone.
Kind of my next question is the very simple, now what?
Yeah. Well, it's the hardest question for me to answer. So the first now what that's really important is, it all kind of starts locally, right? And for us, that means our state legislature that's making decisions. As we sit in this room, they're sitting in rooms making difficult decisions because the state budget is very challenging. Mm-hmm. So the state library was already it was in a pretty desperate hole before this all began, because we're primarily funded by document recording fees. So when people sell a house or buy a house or refinance a house, there's a very small piece of that comes our way. Well, no one is doing those three things very much anymore. So that revenue has just, it's maybe a third of what it was a couple of years ago. So we asked the state to help us with that, what we called stabilization, to keep us whole so that we wouldn't have to lay people off. So we await their decision, and they very well could not do that, or do it at such a small rate that the state part of our organization could be impacted to the extent of 40 or 50% of all resources. And that translates into people, because there's no other way to do that, and open doors. So that's kind of the first step right now is, what can the state do for us to keep our services, just keep our doors open, try to keep the services, the barest minimum of the wheels on the bus. Mm-hmm. The Institute of Museums and Library Services is, this all happened very suddenly. I mean, are we just barely 2 weeks, 3 weeks since the executive order? And in that time, executive order said they're being eliminated. Staff is given termination notices. All the staff are gone as of, they're all gone out of the agency right now, and they're terminated as of May 3rd or 4th. So we don't know who's still at that agency doing anything. It's none of the known people that we have. And then we have joined, I think it's 20 total states have AGs have a lawsuit saying this isn't okay. So we sit and wait to see what that lawsuit's going to say. But the state of Washington, our grants to state programs that we're in the middle of, we have, 3/4 of the way through, we have payroll, we're meeting with that grant. They've told us they're not going to give us that money anymore. So we're really in this terrible place of, not only do you need to turn the spigot off for water running, but you have to somehow get water back in the spigot. So I don't know what the answer to that question is. We hope that at least for a little while we'll be able to use some resources to keep staff and to find out what our final what the next steps are. But we really need a budget from the state and then an understanding that this federal money is not, in fact, coming. And then we'll have to make some incredibly difficult, impactful, terrible decisions.
Yeah, the lawsuit that you mentioned that was filed, I think, by the 20 or so states' attorneys general, that was filed on, I think, Friday.
That's correct.
We're filming on today's the 8th, so that was Friday the 4th. And there was another lawsuit just filed yesterday by ALA and AFSCME, the Association for Federal and State Municipal and County Employees. I got that acronym wrong, but
it's a tough one.
You know what I mean. You can.
I was impressed you attempted it.
Wasn't really thinking clearly there. Anyway, the lawsuit filed by the attorneys general was seeking injunctive relief. So, I think the best you could hope for is that the court agrees and essentially tells IMLS, and the folks who are running it now that, yes, this grant money that was appropriated by Congress, you do have to pay out this money that was promised, which could, in theory, buy a little bit of time is how I read that.
Yes.
But then you still have to kind of look at the bigger picture, which is to say that on the whole, this money still has to be then approved in future budgets. Congress is still going to have to appropriate money towards IMLS in the future, and maybe they do and maybe they don't. So it feels like you could maybe hope for a reprieve through the courts, but how long is that going to last you?
Yeah.
These things still have to be sorted on a level that's more sustainable.
Yeah, that's exactly true. The Institute of Museums and Library Services and the Museum and Library Services Act, so yet another acronym, that needed to be reauthorized in 2026. Now, there are some agencies, federal agencies, that get money without a reauthorization, but I think, in light of what's going on, I think I don't think that's very realistic to think that that somehow money will keep flowing and the museum is that whole entity is gone. The other thing that Acting Director Sonderling did is he essentially, in addition to terminating all the staff, he also terminated the National Advisory Board. So they aren't given money, but it's just a stellar group of people who guide this agency to do good work. And I think late last week, they were all sent notices that your services are no longer needed. Mm-hmm. And of course, that's a calculated thing of, being appointed to that board means that you're one of the, someone with great deal of influence and understanding of the library world. So it's yet another way to cut off the places that make this an effective organization. And of course, it's very concerning. So even if the judge says, turn the money back on, is that staff that have been let go, would they come back? Could they come back? What does that even look like? So it feels like this was a very calculated and strategic effort to ensure that that this agency gets decimated to a point that comeback is very difficult.
Right.
And then, the roll forward is, does that happen to us as state libraries? Every state library has some different funding, but most of them are very much like ours. There's this federal piece that's fairly significant, and there's state resources and maybe some other, grant resources. But state libraries, as we know them, if this money goes away for good, we don't have a future either.
Yeah, and you mentioned E-rate funding earlier, and E-rate funding is, as I understand it, not part of LSTA specifically. It's
But
through.
it's under fire too.
Yeah, yeah, exactly, and that's a significant chunk of money,
Yes.
and that would absolutely impact Timberland directly because we get E-rate funding, and that would be a massive chunk. Well, I don't say a massive. I don't want to overstate it, but it would be
It's huge. I mean,
a significant chunk of our
you
budget.
generally can get whatever you're paying for internet as much as 80% back. You have to pay it out and then you get reimbursed for it, but that's how all federal money works. But yeah, that funding is in crisis right now too. So, and that was something that I meant to do is the K-20 network. I was going to ask them if they could, because we know what we're supporting, and you guys could probably, public libraries could help us, but it's tens of millions, and if you include schools, it's tens and tens of millions of dollars. I hate to put a number on it, but there won't be anchor institutions or access to the internet in any way we understand it if that goes away. And that's, what a breathtaking thing to say, because you are in this district have a lot of small libraries. So if you're out there on the market buying really expensive, and if they're the only game in town, you have to pay whatever they're going to charge. So it's going to have a breathtaking impact. It's a train running kind of separately than LSTA, but it's the same forces that are trying to derail it.
It certainly doesn't give you any optimism in general.
No. So it's hard, and our eternal optimism, right? We're trying to find a way through this. So
what can library users do? Is there anything they can do? What would make the most impact?
Well, for the Institute of Museums and Library Services, it's contact your Congress people and tell them that the program's important and that they need to, help do everything they can that we follow the law. Because the law really says that these actions, in the view of the AGs and many other interpretations, this grants to states and the award we got was a legal obligation. So telling Congress that they need to follow the law, that's who they are and what they do, I think that's an important message. And then, our state legislators too, they're in the very midst of a very difficult budget thing, and just, I think, contacting your local state legislator and telling them, we want a state library and we need to have this, this is important to us. The beginning of the Washington State Library is the one that's just down the street from here. We have 2.1 million items that we've been collecting since territorial times, and we don't use the federal money to support that, but our state money there is at the point that if we don't get some relief there, we won't be able to be open except for by appointment. And I was thinking, that's a pretty large collection, 2.1 million items. And right now we have 15 people caring for those. If we lose a vast majority of staff, then, there's a lot of stuff at risk. So
we refer people to
historical
those resources
things that people either can't have access to, or, we have acres and acres and acres of microfilm, and microfilm can get something called vinegar syndrome. So if that happens, it just disintegrates, like in a Mission Impossible way. So we just, if people are concerned about libraries and our history and our knowledge, we need help and support to keep that alive. And I don't have optimism that we'll be made whole, but we need enough to be in a kind of a status quo caretaking mode until things can get better. We can resolve, the state funding gets a little better, and then, some action. I mean, who knows, maybe there's some reconstitution at the federal level and some state resources come back in a block grant kind of way. I don't think that's unrealistic, but I think IMLS, the way we know it, is gone. And I can't tell you how hard that is for me to say. It's something I just don't think I ever thought I would say that. And it's really tragic, and there's no good reason that I can come up with in any way, shape, or form that's an outcome that people want. Our hope is that it becomes unacceptable at some level, but every day we get up and there's something else that we are outraged about. So it's hard to be sure that this outrage will translate into a different decision.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to think it will. I want to be hopeful, and people's voices matter. When you call your Congress people and your state legislators and tell them, hey, this matters to me, it's important, that works. It really, really does work. So, and we live in a democracy where voices matter. So I guess the very long answer to your short question is make your voices heard. Mm-hmm. Tell the people that make these decisions that libraries are critical and need support at every level. Mm-hmm. Here, the local support too. It's, it feels like that it's a major attack at every level to continue to do services that, really are. Anytime you poll or ask, people really love and care about and use their libraries. They matter. Mm-hmm. One thing that's, as we try to catalog all the things that are going to be lost, there's, American Library Association and our we talk a lot about things like there are more visits to libraries than there are to all sports venues combined. So every sporting event in the United States, we have more visits, public libraries combined. Well, how we know that? We give that data to the state library, who gives it to IMLS, and they're not going to do it anymore. So we won't have that kind of data. We have data where if you want to create a new library branch in a small community, or you want to recalibrate services, you can look at data and say, oh, here's a similar community with the same demographics, size, economics. What kind of size of library should I build there? And you can look and right now you could find that and do that research. That's going to be gone. So. It's, I was asked by someone, well, what will we keep it for the state? I said, well, I don't know, because number one, there's some value to that, but it's more valuable when it was nationwide. And secondarily, who am I going to have do it?
Yeah.
I won't have a person that's supporting that. And, we haven't covered all the things, but, we've covered a lot of things that if there's a gap and services just need some support, that's what we're there for, and that's what we've done, and that's what will be lost.
We can, in our show notes of this episode, include some links for folks who want to make their voices heard and want to take some action. And so you can look in our show notes for some links and some information on where to go to get started. I think a good way to close out today's episode and what we've been talking about is actually with a quote that didn't make it into an interview article that Muriel, who's one of our regional managers in Lewis County, gave to the Chronicle on March 25th. And she shared that with me, and it says, "Our country's public libraries don't exist in a vacuum from each other. We make up an ecosystem. We support each other nationally to grow the services that people rely on. My library system is not primarily funded by IMLS, but many libraries in our country are. And when you weaken some of our libraries, you weaken us all."
It's, very profound.
Well said. Well, thank you, Sara, for being here with us today. And we wish the best for you and your work that you're doing to support IMLS and the State Library. And hopefully we can have you back on the podcast under better circumstances in the future.
Yeah, I'd like that very much.
Yes, we appreciate your time so much. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for joining us on today's episode. Don't forget to follow or subscribe on your preferred podcast platform. Your feedback helps us improve and reach more listeners.
You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok at Timberland Library. If you have any questions or comments, you can email us at trlpodcast@trl.org.
Original music is by our very own librarian and talented musician, Stefan, at the Yelm Branch.
Until next time, stay curious, stay inspired, and keep the conversation going. Thank you for being a part of the TRL community.